compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. I am Carlos El Chicon, your host, and I am joined today by my colleagues, Mr. Eugene Meininger.
Howdy, folks.
And Mr. Kevin Fiesel.
Hello.
Well, gentlemen, thanks for being here. And compañeros, thank you for your patience, right? I feel like it's been a hot minute since we've done one of these, and thanks for sticking in there. Right? Life happens, and the weather turns nice, and getting in front of the microphone just doesn't have the quite same allure as it once
So
did.
what Carlos is saying is that after Eugene got kidnapped by ninjas, Carlos had to be a bad enough dude to rescue him.
Yeah, that's going to be the next episode, right? So
the throwback to the 80s video games day.
Fun times. Okay, so we wanted to talk today. So I guess let me tell you what we're not going to talk about. What we're not going to talk about is SQL Server 2022. So we should say that it did get released not too long ago, at least as of this recording. And we are eventually going to do an episode on that. But I wanted to play around with it just a little bit more before we talk about it. So we'll wait there. And I thought, hey, you know what? We just had build. So I guess at build, they announced did that line up? Yeah, the 24th. They, generally available, I'm using the wrong words. Release candidate. No, that's not even right word.
Are you talking about community tech previews?
Is it community tech preview? Is that okay? So whatever
that's the acronym. Yeah.
CTP.
So CTP. Thank you. I'm like, it's not just. I have to go backwards here. Like, wait. What did they actually release? Yes, CTP is now available for. So now we can all download it, right? We don't have to go to Microsoft and ask permission to download it. There's something we can actually download. And so I would like to get back to that. But today, during the Build 2022 event, they mentioned some things, and I thought that we should chat about them. And so that's what we want to do today. So the show notes for today's episode is going to be at Build 2022 or at SQL Data Partners. It's going to be available at SQLDataPartners.com/Build22, Build 2022. Man, I can't speak. Or at SQLDataPartners.com/246, as this is episode 246, compañeros. Okay, so before we get into all of that, as always, we do like to do a few compañeros shout-outs. And there's a long list today, as the length of our list.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The frequency of our episodes, right, go hand in hand. So here we go. We've got Paul Schur, Karthik Y, the Tamurundo himself. I don't know who that is, but hey, Tamurundo. Adam Hayers, Dan Watson, Brandon Michaels, Ashan Kabir, Ganesh Kumar Kijikan, Chris Mercer, John Cates, Chris Simeon, Shania Ewell, Cardell Washington, Cindy Chacon, Braden McCann, John Surley, Nancy Tickle, Gordana Bellick, Hillary Wilkie, Jeff Crook, Elad Cohen, Mala, first name, right? Mala's a first name, kind
She's
of
on the Cher level, yeah.
Beyonce, Cher, right? Wong, Mala, right? Peter Shore, Thael, Lucas Fernandez, Facundo Capdevilla, Andy Leonard, and last but not least, Sam. Is it Nasser? Nasser?
Yeah, so. Sam Nasser.
Yeah, who's going to be on a future episode of the podcast here coming up in just a couple of weeks. Okay, so I think that is all of them. And as always, compañeros, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for engaging with us on social media. We do appreciate it. So as we jump into this, right, as always, should you need a helping hand with your SQL servers, you want somebody to lean on, or perhaps, right, SQL Server, like today we're talking about build. I know we have lots of developers that listen to the program, right? If you are in the position where you feel like you need someone to, hey, can you take a peek at this, help me out, give me some information. or even right like an escalation resource. Here's what we're thinking. What do you think? Second pair of eyes. Feel free to reach out to us. SQL Data Partners can help you with those pieces and help make that SQL Server experience better. So with that, let's jump into the notes, right? So in terms of follow-up, a lot of this, I'm actually going to quote Satya here in the keynote here a couple of times. But first, I feel like we should jump into, and Microsoft says that they have 31 million developers. Now, they don't necessarily quantify how they got there, right? So I was going to assume those are GitHub accounts. Is that fair, right? So they
Makes sense.
Yeah. So now as Microsoft owns GitHub, right? It's like, hey, all of our stuff, all of our code is touching all these developers. And so let's go ahead and touch on some of those developer pieces. And so, Kevin, I'd be interested to get your take. Some of this had already been announced, but they've enhanced them a bit, right? So the idea of GitHub code spaces. So I guess we didn't really talk about this before, Kevin, but is that something that y'all's team have used, or is a code spaces taken off?
No, I've not used GitHub code spaces. The concept, by the way, is pretty cool. The general idea is you can use Visual Studio Code, kick off a virtual machine, and basically do development there so that it's not necessarily on your really low-end laptop. As long as you're able to run Visual Studio Code, essentially you're doing all the work remotely. Obviously, to do that, internet connection is necessary, but you can kick up a fairly powerful machine in a very short amount of time. That's one of the things about this is not go build a virtual machine in Azure, which is going to take 5-10 minutes for it to be allocated, for the OS to be installed and everything going. The machines are already there. They're pre-provisioned for utilization.
Right.
So in that sense, there's some nice capability with it. Of course, you have to pay.
It's all pay to play.
Not too,
which we'll get into. That it comes into account a little bit later. But go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. I say that's probably enough of a basic introduction. So that's the general idea. It is still kind of technically, I think, being rolled out. I believe it's technically still in a beta, but it's a very broad beta.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, I thought that they had general released that, but maybe they're still working out some pieces.
It might be. It may have been GA'd, but I think if it was that build.
Right. Yeah. So again, so I guess the code spaces was the genesis. That was something that happened last year. Right now they've got the dev boxes, and supposedly they can be managed in your regular Azure environment as well. So you log into the portal, and you'll see them there as well. Now, another one that I thought was interesting, and I guess was curious what this might mean for on the horizon, right? So again, kind of sticking with the GitHub theme. So GitHub CoPilot, which is ultimately an AI paired programmer. So this is, I kind of feel like the way he made it sound was IntelliSense on steroids. Right, but and he showed all these.
It's a Markov chain on steroids. I don't know if I'd call it IntelliSense on steroids.
I mean, a bit, yeah. So before Eugene can get his take in, I'm gonna flambe this take right here.
Yeah.
GitHub Copilot is a really cool concept. It is fun to play with, and it is also the type of thing that if my developers were regularly using this and just going with whatever it generated, I would smack them on the wrist with a ruler, Catholic nun style, because this is essentially, I'm going to copy the first thing from Stack Overflow and paste it into my code until it gives me code results that are roughly what I think they should be. except that we're getting it from GitHub. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is all of those projects that are on GitHub, all of those open source publicly available repos, how often do you find security vulnerabilities? Basic stuff like SQL injection attacks, cross-site request forgery, cross-site scripting issues. How often do you see, well, I just threw in a really simple demo to get it to work, and the really simple demo obviated away everything that was security related, made things that were very not safe in terms of good practices for development. Now, secondly, this is where Lawyer Man jumps in and says, wait a minute, where did this code come from? Because if this code came from something that was AGPL or GPL v3, and now it shows up in your code base, then the question becomes, okay, so AGPL and GPL v3 are very strongly worded about how you're supposed to open source code that makes use of, especially AGPL, where if you're incorporating AGPL code within some library or some system, the licensing generally requires that you have to open source that thing. The way that companies get around it is essentially you have the AGPL code in a wrapper module, and it goes and calls your really secret code via API, so that you can say, oh no, there's a distinct difference between these. But if you're just enter, take whatever CoPilot says, and you don't know where that code came from, if it came from a library that was AGPL, then there's I think, reasonable question of legal liability of, do I need to now open source this code because the original code came from, like, this was actually taken from the CoPilot is not generating new code as a concept necessarily. I don't know. I don't know if I want to get too far down that road, because technically, yes, it does, because it understands variables and it can translate variables, and you can get into questions about if I saw this algorithm and I typed it out myself, is it the same thing as copying that code? And
this feels a lot like the whole back when like music piracy was a big thing, where people would try to be smart and be like, so if I have a computer just generate every possible song, and then I do a hash search for the one that matches like Toxic by Britney Spears, I didn't copy the song. You know what I mean? Because like, yeah, I agree with Kevin that it feels like there's a lot of like algorithmic whitewashing, right? It's like, because we took all this code and put it into a magical AI soup and it spit something out. Well, you can't prove that it came from this AGPL code, so there's no legal liability. And it's like, I don't know. I don't think that's how it works. But even more so, like, you think about it, whenever Google made Android and they did, like, theoretically a white room implementation of Java, well, they didn't 100% do white room. They had people who had, from my understanding, Kevin can correct me, who had seen some of the Java code or that sort of stuff, and they lost or had a serious issue with their lawsuit over like a 12-line piece of code. It was like range check or range scan or something. And so if you can potentially lose $1 billion lawsuit over a 12-line piece of code that anyone could write in their sleep, right? Like, how much more risky is it to have this piece of AI basically copying and pasting code for you? You know, so I agree. I think I've heard at least one video game developer podcast where he really likes CoPilot because he has some focus issues, and so it allows him to kind of stay in the flow and stay in the moment. And so again, if you're doing like side projects or something like for yourself that you're not selling commercially, you know, fine. But I agree with all the issues that Kevin brought up, and the liability one was the one that first came to mind, right? Because they're not, and they've said this, they're not just going, okay, we're going to only look for MIT licensed projects that say you can do whatever you want with the code. They're anything. If it's on GitHub and it's public, they're scanning
model,
it.
right?
Right? Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So obviously there are some, some pieces there, right? So if you're developing, right, then keep that in
Carlos is uninstalling it right now. He's really embarrassed.
Well, no. So I was at my curiosity was, again, when I think about some of these things, I always think, okay, so how is that going to eventually make it into my world, right? So in terms of, would that get integrated at some point into managing studio, or more likely right, Azure data studio, and could we, because they talk about the number of languages that are available and whatnot, right? And so now all of a sudden can we is it going to touch TSQL, right? And so that was kind of my curiosity, and kind of where what I wanted to. So I guess what's your thoughts there? Do you think it would ever kind of make it down that way, or?
I mean, personally, no.
Right?
I mean, so like, at least in my opinion, code, like compiled code, is a lot more Stack Overflowable than SQL will ever be, right? Because so much of it is in reference to specific columns and specific tables and all that kind of stuff. Whereas theoretically, a lot of like scripted and compiled code is much more modular. So it's just hard for me to see something like that. I mean, the closest I could imagine is something similar to some of the Redgate tools, but maybe just a little bit more advanced. I could see something like that, but I don't think CoPilot's coming to SQL anytime soon.
I mean, I would agree. I don't think TSQL would be a big priority for them. You can do a lot more in terms of templating, in terms of automating. I know that this is the on clause that you're expecting because you have these two tables joined together and you did a good job and have a foreign key constraint, and therefore I can define this. I would tend to agree, though, that I don't think SQL is a particularly AI automatable language in the sense of by the time it becomes useful,
you already have so much.
I don't think you're going to. Yeah, it's like you've got 99% of this here. So
right.
What am I going to automate? Am I going to automate the select clause? Well, I mean, you can have tools that do that today.
Sure.
So Redgate's SQL prompt or any of the other tools that are on the market that allow you to autofill those. You want joins? Well, you're going to have to understand the data schema more than the syntax of the language.
Right.
And if you know the data schema, again, tools that are already on the market can help you out significantly with that, with your joins. Right. If you don't know the data schema, then well, the AI-based system's not going to help you either because it's going to have to read tables, and maybe you have column names that match, but that may not even be correct because all of my tables have ID as the key column, for example, which is not a great practice for this reason.
Never happen.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man, those databases are always the best to pull into Power BI because the default it tries to auto connect all the relationships, and so you'll just have like 12 tables all connected, and you're like, oh no.
I have to unspaghetti this.
Yeah. So if you have a good data model, basically SQL prompt or Apex SQL or whoever's tool you want to use will save you a pretty fair amount of processing time in terms of typing. But I don't know that you're going to get too much smarter than that because it's not going to know what is the business question that you're trying to solve. Where I've noticed CoPilot be most efficient is I see a pattern where you have done A, you have done B, you have done C. Now I can intuit that you probably want D, which is very often in the case where I'm going to have a whole set. I'm going to take all but some subset. And now as soon as I start typing, it's like, oh, you probably want the subset you haven't worked with. And that's something that's not very common in TSQL where you can readily intuit that, I don't think.
Right. Yeah, still have to have an understanding of the data. So yeah, so still, I guess it was interesting how that came about, and again, like how how it's gonna make its way in there. And there is one. You know what? In fact, let's go ahead and jump to that. And we will come back to containers if we so choose. So the again, this is coming from Satya's keynote, and he says, hey, right, we need a way to create data governance, analytics, and the database all in one, kind of all, working in harmony, right? And, his reasoning for that is, right, every app's going to be intelligent, right? And analytics just can't be a back-end process anymore, right? We need a way for the app to be able to be smart and figure out, hey, I do this, right? Then, it should be that, or, suggest this other thing or do this thing, what have you. So he then introduces the Microsoft Intelligent Data Platform. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. This is going to, what's going to happen, right? All of a sudden, I'm like, hey, thanks, Carlos. But we have the intelligent platform now, right? We'll just let Eugene,
right.
do all the reporting for us, and we're good. And it makes it. Well, I guess I don't want to say that. But then he said the little words that I thought were interesting. He's like, yeah, you can use Cosmos DB or Azure SQL Hyperscale. And then that made me think, oh, this is very, very niche, right? Like,
yes,
very, very, very high end, right? Yeah, you're doing millions of e-commerce, millions of sales in e-commerce every day. Then yeah, it might make sense. But I feel like for the regular Joes, not quite there just yet.
You mean you don't have all of your SMBs working on Azure SQL Hyperscale?
You're looking at that pricing. Our budgets just aren't that big, Kevin, right? Life on the D list, we have to make do. Although if somebody is you forgive me, tangent for a second, if somebody has been working with Hyperscale, I do know someone wants to speak with you, so reach out to me. They're looking for a real world example of someone who's touched it. So
the fact that Carlos has to ask indicates something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I have. Everybody's like, well, and it's in fairness, it is pretty new, right? I mean, it just really, I don't know when they released it, right? But it's a fairly new thing, and Microsoft's trying to sell it to all the big players now, right? And
right.
So it's kind of that chicken or egg, right? So how do you get experience, right? You get experience by using it, but how do you know? Anyway.
Yep. Yeah. I think, as a what Jim Collins would call a BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal. This concept, okay, you know what? I'll let it slide. Realistically, no, but you want to drive people toward an aspiration. You want to drive people toward this concept of where things could be. Okay, sure. Intelligent applications, for some definition of intelligence. I mean, I just want stuff that's easier to work and is less prone to giving you weird error messages that are like, the issue was accessible. Like, that's not even a word. That's not a word. Where I just want to see things work together and, it just fits. I mean, until you want to do a real use case, in which case now you have to plumb together 15 separate things yourself, but they just fit. I mean, until you want security, in which case now you have to go through all kinds of rigmarole.
I think there's CoPilot for that, right? We want security.
Right. If you want to avoid security, there's CoPilot for that. And by the way, this is not just me smack talking Microsoft all day. This is me smack talking AWS and Google and every other situation.
I think the problem it feels like to me, and this has been going on for a decade now, is it used to be that we had the golden hammer, we had SQL Server, and it was the one tool for everything. And it had SQL Server reporting services, integration services, and just smack it with SQL Server, problem solved. And then they're like, oh, with this cloud thing, it makes sense to make these niche tools. So we're going to make a corkscrew, and we're going to make a knife, and we're going to make like the bottle opener and all these kinds of things. And the dream in their head is they're going to sell you the Swiss Army knife, and that's the Microsoft Intelligent Platform. But what seems to happen is instead we get the drawer below the silverware drawer with like the potato smasher and the pizza cutter and all this stuff.
7 different pizza cutters of slightly different sizes.
and so like it feels like every 2 years they start to like get these tools a little bit closer, a little bit more connected, a little bit more coherent. But I think that's the problem whenever you try to have like this Cretaceous era, like biodiversity explosion of all these different species of Azure data tools. And then you're like, maybe survival of the fittest wasn't the best product planning method, right? It's like, okay, we've got Azure Purview, but it's built on the trilobite of Azure Data Catalog. You know what I mean? On top of the fossils of what came before. So I don't know. That's how it feels for me.
Yeah. So it is interesting you mentioned that, because I was thinking, okay, so Azure Purview, right? So real or not real. Now, before we started recording, right, Kevin, we started talking about Purview, but it feels they keep talking about it at least. Now I can't tell if they've decided like, well, if we keep talking about it, maybe we'll catch on, or if this thing actually has some teeth to it.
So you're saying they're trying to make fetch a thing.
It's funny.
Okay. I do think that there is a lot of value in what is now Microsoft Purview. It used to be Azure Purview until Build. At Build, they collided together Azure Purview and Microsoft 365 compliance, smacked that together, called it Microsoft Purview. So that's why there's a name change, because marketing got involved.
There we go.
As a concept, Purview's very interesting. I was pretty excited about it. It's very expensive for my tastes.
Sure.
That I think is the biggest knock on it right now. What it can do, what it promises to do, and what it can do to a limited extent is really interesting. And that is data lineage throughout the entire Azure space,
Right.
Where
that's
you
kind of
can
the new
figure out.
wrinkle, right? That's the new thing that they added is the whole data lineage option. Yeah.
Right. And so you can start to see what makes for good data governance in this product. There's a long way to go for it, and I really want to see it drop considerably in price. But as a concept, I think it is much better than what Azure Data Catalog was. And it's critical that Microsoft have something like this in Azure, because otherwise, for data governance, you're kind of limited. There's actually a lot of good third-party solutions, but those third-party solutions say, well, why do you need to be on Azure? So at that point, it's like, well, just take it off of Azure. We're just as happy.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there, and how that gets rolled out. I do think that the jump to get into Purview, you mentioned price, but I also feel like, again, if I'm building new, right, integrating with Azure Purview makes a lot of sense. If I'm trying to migrate, hey, let me take what I've got and move it over, it still feels like an awful big hurdle to jump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's part of the pain of data governance. If you didn't have, if your governance strategy was not, then yeah, there's going to be a lot of prep work involved. There's a lot of documentation. There's a lot of stuff that developers don't like doing and historically haven't done that you kind of have to undo in order to get yourself sorted.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there might be a couple other things that we circle back around to. I'm actually going to call it for today's episode. Sure.
We have hit our hot take quota for the day.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you, gentlemen, once again for coming on and chatting about this. So if folks want to reach out to you on social media, how can they do so, Eugene?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at SQLgene.
Mr. Kevin?
If you open up GitHub CoPilot and you start typing F# code and ask, it'll give you my credentials.
There we go. Very secure.
Not even my social media information, like the actual credentials to my social media stuff. So you can go post for me because I don't want to.
And compañeros, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon. Again, thanks for tuning in. This is episode 246, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
SQL Data Partners.